You are listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide, a weekly shortwave radio program and online podcast dedicated to uncensored, politically incorrect biblical teaching. To learn more about Christian America Ministries, visit our website, christianamericaministries.org. And now the broadcast.
Greetings in the blessed holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. We're broadcasting around the world on shortwave radio and over the internet at kingdomradioonline.com, as well as our YouTube channel, Christian America Ministries on YouTube, and Spotify and TuneIn as well. And if you're listening to us on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. That helps out the channel. And also, if you're listening to us on shortwave radio, we would love a reception report. Now, I know that's old-fashioned for those people listening on the internet, but those listening on shortwave, those reception reports help out a great deal. Lets us know what frequencies people are listening to us on and where we need to focus our efforts. So if you can go to our website, christianamericaministries.org, and go to our contact page, and send us a reception report. Let us know how, where you're listening, and give us your address, and we will send you a free copy of my book, Israel Dispersed, which just a free gift for taking the time to give us that reception report. Anyway, in this broadcast, this is going to be another installment, I guess you could say, where I'm going to respond to the critics of Anglo-Israel. This is the third installment. It's kind of turned into maybe like a little series, a periodic series of messages where I take a sermon that, and fragments of sermons that people are using or either directly or indirectly attempting to rebuttal the Anglo-Israel message. And that is the belief that the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, and Scandinavian, and Celtic, and Kindred people are the true physical descendants of God's covenant people, Israel, rather than the popular Judeo-Christian belief that the modern-day Jews are Israel. The Anglo-Israel belief rejects that idea. They think it's false, and I'm of that persuasion. I've preached on it a lot. And rather, they think that the Anglo-Saxon, and believe and think that the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, and Kindred people, who became a multitude of nations, became a multitude of people, along with fulfilling all the other promises given to the Israelites in the Abrahamic covenant, like in Genesis chapter 17. And they are those people. They fulfill those promises, and the modern-day Jews do not. And in this broadcast, I'm going to be responding to a lecture by the late David Pawson entitled British Israelites. That's the lesson title. And David Pawson was an English minister and author, and it appears this sermon is the last of a series of sermons that he's addressing several different beliefs and sects that he disagrees with, and he threw this belief in on the tail end of this series. And I haven't listened to the other messages, just this one. And in this sermon, he is rebutting what is known as British Israelism, which is another name for Anglo-Israelism. Now, I personally do not care for the term British Israelism, as it is rather confusing for those outside of Britain. It's a little bit of a dated term, and and sometimes, depending on how people use it, it can come with different theological baggage or something like that. In the way that he's using it, it only means those who believe that the Anglo-Saxon and Kindred people are physical descendants of Israel. So if you have any other theological points that you're attaching to that term, it's just not used that way. The Israel message has gone by many different names and terms through the decades, much like many other different belief terms and things like that. And British Israelism became a very popular term to use during the 1800s because primarily all those who taught it during those years were British. I mean, there was a large majority of British people that taught it. And many of those British ministers discovered that their people were Israel during a period of time when the sun never set on the British Empire. I mean, it was huge. One of the largest empires, or the largest empire of all time. And many of them falsely began to think that the British Empire was the stone kingdom from the prophecy in Daniel chapter 2. And I do not agree with that view. But I can understand why they came to this conclusion given the height of the British Empire at the time, since the mid to late 1800s was a time full of new ideas of eschatology that were just simply wrong. I don't fault them for coming to this conclusion. They were wrong on it, but I understand how they came to that conclusion. The mid to late 1800s was full of a lot of false eschatological views and things of that nature, and a lot of different ideas floating around. And the Israel message was much older than that. So the term British Israel stuck with a lot of the British. But I don't care for it today because it is a confusing term. I prefer Anglo-Israel, which it was used during that period too, interchangeably. And another thing that is often said by critics, that British Israelism or Anglo-Israelism believes that actually this is more of the people that use British Israelism, that they only believe that the British are Israelites. And somehow the people of Norwegian, French, or Irish descent or something like that are not Israelites as well in that theory. And this is just a misunderstanding, a false misunderstanding of how the term was used during that time. No one believed that. The British believe that their kindred people, the French, the Irish, the Norwegian, and so forth, the people that they came from, that were of the same kindred, that they were Israel too. So that's another reason why I don't like British Israelism, the term, because it's confusing in that way. So it's kind of an outdated term. Now, in this clip, Dawson is given this lecture, and he is presenting three basic ideas held by those who believe in the Anglo-Israel message. So let's go ahead and dive in, and let's listen to what he has to say. And we're going to try to finish this up in one broadcast, but there is a possibility that this may go into two broadcasts. We'll see. I don't think so, but we may have to. Here's the first clip.
Now let's take the basic ideas. The first basic belief of the British Israel movement is that 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were lost, and were lost about 600 years before Christ, and they vanished at that time.
This is a big misunderstanding a lot of times, and a lot of it's just because of terminology. The lost tribes of Israel is really a bad term, even though it's been used by all kinds of different people. And a lot of times we'll be accused of saying that we believe that the lost tribes vanished into thin air somewhere, and that there is a such thing as lost tribes, that they actually got lost somewhere in the earth. And that's just not the case. And the critics will come along and say, well, they weren't lost, you're calling them lost tribes, and then rightly so. And they'll show scriptural evidence of how they weren't lost. The truth is, though, is they lost their identity. They didn't get lost, they lost their identity. And we believe that the northern house of Israel went into Assyrian captivity. And because they were divorced from God at that moment in time, they were cut off, unlike Judah. And they were sent into Assyrian captivity, and they become a diaspora. They dispersed through the earth. And then after that captivity, they migrated northwest and changed their name over time, many different names over time. And there was more migrations before the Assyrian captivity as well, which hopefully we'll get into in this broadcast. But if not, I'll give you some resources towards the end where you can dig into it a little bit more. But these people change their name over time, like it happens with any kind of people when they start migrating and breaking up into different nations. This is just normal. I have ancestors who were Germans and English and Irish and French. But you know what? I'm not known as those names today. The names have changed. The languages have changed in their descendants. So it's not much different than what happened with Israel. They went into Assyrian captivity. Their cultures changed to a great degree. Their names changed, and they were dispersed like God promised. And book I mentioned at the beginning, The Dispersed of Israel, goes in great detail into that. But they were never lost. They only lost their identity as Israel. Big difference. Now let's listen to what else he has to say.
The second major belief is that the 10 tribes have in fact been found primarily among the English-speaking peoples of Britain and America. Britain being the lost tribe of Ephraim, and America being the lost tribe of Manasseh. And those being the two largest tribes of the 10 in Israel, these two nations between them are therefore the heart of God's Israel. And the third belief is the belief that the prophecies in the Old Testament about the future of Israel apply therefore to the United Kingdom and the United States. Now that's, in a nutshell, the belief of British Israel. There are many different variations, there are different details, and I'm going to go into quite a lot. But these are the three basic beliefs, and on these a very great deal has been built in the various publications of the British Israelite movement.
Back to what I said originally, they haven't been found because they were never lost. They just lost their identity. There was always Anglo-Saxon and Kindred people who knew who they were. But as a whole, their identity had been forgotten. And I'll give some evidence through history here shortly on different people who believe this, long before the 1800s or 1700s there in England. Now, it is true that it was and is a common belief that some do believe that the Britain is the tribe of Ephraim and America is the tribe of Manasseh. Now, I don't necessarily adhere to this belief in a literal sense because all the tribes were intermingled to the point that no one knew their Israelite identity or their tribal identity to that extent. I mean, for example, America over the last 300 years was made up of Anglo-Saxon people from all over Europe, not just one group from one region. So at any point when someone tries to tie this group of people with a certain tribe of Israel, or someone says that they are from a certain tribe, I have a hard time with that concept. And I know some people say they're from this tribe and that tribe, but to me that just doesn't make any sense when you study genealogy. Because just for me, when I did some family genealogy, I have ancestors from all over Europe. I mean, England, Ireland, French, German. And then when you look into them, they intermingled over time as well. So some people who adhere to Anglo-Israel, when they say that this nation is this tribe and this nation is that tribe in a literal sense, I have a hard time grasping that. I mean, I'm open to changing, but a lot of those people lost their tribal identity and intermingled and became as one people. And to me, it just trying to identify this tribe or that tribe with that nation just doesn't make a lot of sense because they intermingled so much as a one people. And when I mean intermingle, I'm talking about as one racial people, European. And I'm welcome to be corrected on that, but that's where I stand on it. So in a literal sense, I do not believe that Britain is Ephraim and America is Manasseh. There may be some prophetic points to be made there in a prophetic sense, but not a literal sense. Let's listen to the next clip and see what he has to say.
Now, when did it all begin? I suppose one would have to go back to the year 1590. That's the earliest that we can trace this idea. And it was a Frenchman. Let's get his name spelled right. I don't know how you pronounce it. I'm not very well up in French. Le Loyer? I have no idea. But it was this French magistrate who wrote a book in 1590 called The 10 Lost Tribes Found. And that seems to have been the beginning.
The book that he's referring to was written by the French Huguenot counsellor Le Loyer And the book was titled The 10 Lost Tribes Found, and it advocated the English Anglo-Saxon people as being descendants of Israel. Now, I would love a copy, obviously a reproduction of this book. All we have is snips of it. This here is a quote from a newspaper that in 1913 that says this concerning the book. Quote, "This Lee Loyar wrote a big volume on a question that has often been raised and that no one has ever been able to solve, that of knowing what has come of the 10 lost tribes of the Jewish people. He showed that the 10 tribes are not lost; they form today the English people." End quote. And that was a newspaper that was quoting about that book. And you can even see in that newspaper they used the 10 lost tribes of the Jewish people, which really should be Israelite people, there in that sense, which gives the misunderstanding, and even the title of his book, The Lost Tribes, which people will use and say, oh, they were never lost. And they're right. They lost their identity. But was this the beginning? That's what I want to talk about here. Was this the beginning of this belief? And the answer is no. Although I do give Dawson credit for going back this far, as many critics do not. They usually end with like Herbert W. Armstrong or Richard Brothers, which we'll talk about here in a minute, in the 1800s. I have wrote a book on the history of the Anglo-Israel movement and the history of those who have believed this truth, titled Anglo-Israel Messengers. It's a 160-page book. And it's a history book documenting the people who have believed this truth. You can go to my website, ChristianAmericanMinistries.org, or go to Amazon and you can get you a copy. I'm currently working on the second edition, which I hope to have done in a year or so, which I'm thinking is going to be double the size of this book, just documenting the history. But I want to give a few examples of how this was not the beginning. The first one is Gildas the Wise. He was a British historian. From 500, he lived from 500 AD to 570 AD, and he was a British historian. He wrote this in his book on the ruin and conquest of Britain concerning the British people. It says this: "After this time, sometimes our countrymen, sometimes the enemy, won the field to the end that our Lord might in this land try after his accustomed manner these his Israelites, whether they loved him or not, until the year of the siege of Mount Badon." End quote. Now, in this quote, he is referring to his countrymen, the English, as Israelites in this quote, in this history book on the ruin and conquest of Britain. That is in the 500s. Another document, which we'll probably talk about later on in the broadcast, is the Declaration of Arbroath. Now, anyone listening from England or Scotland or Ireland will probably be familiar with this document. It was written in 320 AD on behalf of King Robert the Bruce, in which the Scots declared their independence from England. Now, in this document, the author clearly states his belief in the Scots' Israelite heritage by stating the following. This is from the Declaration of Arbroath. It's on display, I believe, in Edinburgh. It's considered like the equivalent of the Declaration of Independence for Scotland. And he says this in this national document, quote, "We know, most Holy Father and Lord, and from the chronicles and books of the ancient gathers, that among other illustrious nations, ours, to wit, the nation of the Scots, has been distinguished by many honors, which passing from the greater Scythia, through the Mediterranean Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and sojourning in Spain among the most savage tribes through a long course of time, could nowhere by subjugated by any people, however barbarous, in coming thence 1,200 years after the outgoing of the people of Israel, they, by many victories and infinite toil, acquired for themselves the possession in the west, which they now hold in their kingdom 113 kings of their own royal stock, no stranger in Verning have reigned." End quote. Now, that is from the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320 AD, a national document that was sent to the Pope at the time, declaring the Scottish independence from England. Now, what would have gotten in these people's brains to believe that they came from Israelites? Well, it says here at the beginning, we know, most Holy Father and Lord, and from the chronicles and books of the ancients gather. So, quite obviously, at this moment in time, there were books that taught this information. Now, I just read a quote from the 500s that insinuated that the English were Israelite in origin. And then in 1320, we have Scottish people talking about them being as Israelites. Another book from the 1500s, actually, no, this one is 1614, was written by Adrian van der Schierek. He was a Flemish office holder that had the title of the Lord of Rodern. And he was an author. He's best known for his research in the Flemish language, and he wrote this in his book in 1614, quote, "The Netherlands with the Gauls and the Germans together in the earliest times were called Celts, who are come out of the Hebrews." End quote. And that is from that book in 1614. He also is associating the Celts and the Germans and the Gauls connection with the Hebrews. Now we have Sir Francis Drake, and you may know who this is. He was an English explorer, a sea captain, and he wrote a letter to Reverend John Fox and made this comment concerning England. It says here, quote, "God may be glorified, his church, our queen, and country preserved, the enemies of truth vanquished, that we might have continued peace in Israel. Our enemies are many, but our protector commandeth the whole earth." End quote. Now, he isn't speaking of the nation of Israel. This is in the 1500s. He is speaking of England in the context of this. So he is calling England Israel. Another man that wrote a book in 1649. His name was John Sadler. He was an English lawyer. He was a member of the English Parliament. He was a town clerk of London, and he was the private secretary for Oliver Cromwell. In his book, Rights of the Kingdom or Customs of Our Ancestors, in that book, he connects the English people with being of Israelite origin in that book, and you can still get reprints of that today. Okay, let's go on and listen to what else he has to say.
In 1723, a Dutchman in Amsterdam took up the same theme, his name Dr. Aberdeen, and he wrote another book. I haven't got his title.
Jacob Aberdeen, he lived between 1654 to 1727. He was a French Protestant minister, and he was an author. And he wrote in 1723 the book On the Triumphs of Religion. And he identified the Anglo-Saxon people as being descendants of Israel. And this is what he said in that book, quote, "Certainly, unless the 10 tribes have flown into the air, or been plunged into the earth's center, they must be sought in that part of the north which, in the time of Constantine, was converted to the Christian faith, namely among the Iberians, the Armenians, and the Scythians. For that was the place of their dispersion, the wilderness where God caused them to dwell in tents as when they came out of the land of Egypt." End quote. It was Jacob Aberdeen. Let's go back to Mr. Dawson and hear what else he has to say.
Then in 1822, it was taken up by 2 English brothers, the Richard brothers, and they published a book, The Invasion of England by the Saxons.
On this point, Dawson is incorrect. It wasn't 2 brothers named Richard. It was one man named Richard Brothers that he's speaking about, and I write about him in my book if you want to learn more about him. But oftentimes people look to Richard Brothers and they falsely say that he invented this belief, and I've already proven to you so far in the broadcast that that is not true. But it's Richard Brothers, one man, not 2. Let's go back to Dawson.
So it seems to have begun in France, spread to Holland, and reached England about a quarter way through the 19th century, 140, 130 years ago. And since then it has become very prominent in England, and now, of course, has passed to America.
This just can't be. How can it be that it didn't reach England until the 19th century when the Scots believed they were descendants of Israelites in 1320? And then we have the British historian who believed that the British were Israelites in the 500s, not to mention all the other people that I mentioned already. So his statement is completely incorrect. Let's go back and see what else he has to say.
So that there's a kind of growth over the last 300 years, 400 years nearly, from Leloir's book in France. Reader Harris was the man who in England took it up in more recent times, and his book, The 10 Lost Tribes, would be a very good textbook to study if you want to know what is believed. Other names are Commander Studd, Britain's Place in Prophecy is his book, or a Mr. Gare, OBE, The Heritage of the Anglo-Saxon Race. There are other names, Edward Hine, John Wilson, the Reverend Pascoe Gord, and other names which you may well be familiar with.
I really commend Mr. Dawson at this point for researching enough to compile just the list of authors that he just listed. I will add that there are hundreds more during this time period, and he's right. This belief did explode during the 17, 18, and 1900s, even though it existed before. But most critics don't even take the time to look up the books that he just mentioned and the authors, and I'm not sure if he's read all of them or not, and I'm not saying I agree with everything in all the books that he just mentioned, but I am familiar with everybody, and I think everyone he mentioned I wrote about in my book. But I'm very pleased that he took the time to list the ones that he did. Most of the time, critics will say, well, there is no works on this at all, and there's nothing been written on it. It's just just a theory that's passed on verbally. That's just absolutely not true. There's hundreds and hundreds of books written by very, very well-educated and, in many cases, famous people that believe this truth, and I document that in my book. Let's go back to Mr. Dawson and see what else he has to say.
So that's enough about the history of it. You can see the kind of growth. I want to deal specifically with the ideas. Let's take, first of all, the basic idea of the emigration. This is absolutely crucial to the whole idea. It involves the emigration of the 10 lost tribes from the Middle East away through Europe to the west and to England and America. If that took place, then there is good grounds for the rest of the ideas. If it didn't take place, then frankly the whole thing falls to the ground. But it is built on the emigration of those tribes from the Middle East through Europe to America. Now let's look in detail at this emigration. There are two sides to it. The first is, of course, the tribes, how they emigrated, and the second part of it is the monarchy, the royal line. And the two emigrations are quite separate. The tribes are said to come one way, and the monarchy, the royal line, is said to come another way. Quite literally, the tribes are said to come in that kind of direction to England, whereas the royal line came this direction through Spain and Ireland, whereas this came through Russia, Prussia, Germany, and over to Britain. So that while the people came one way, the king came another. So we'll look at these two emigrations and see just what the basic idea is. Now, I'm hoping that you know quite a bit of Old Testament history, but in case you don't, I'm just going to summarize it very briefly. During the three first kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon, they were one people called Israel, composed of 12 different tribes. So during the three reigns of the first three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, 12 tribes made up one nation, which was called Israel. But as soon as Solomon died, there was civil war. And that was the first major step in the breakup of the Jews.
I'd like you to make a note of what he said about halfway through that clip, that if the migrations of Israel took place, with what he's rebutting, he said if they took place, there is good grounds on everything that he's rebutting in this lecture. Now keep that in mind. I agree with what he says here concerning the house of Israel and the house of Judah. I mean, he's just repeating biblical history. I do disagree with how he used the word Jew there at the end, because all of Israel were not known as Jews during this time. That's just completely incorrect. And it should be Judahite, by the way, but he says that all of the Jews were split up. Well, that doesn't make any sense. You had the house of Israel and you had the house of Judah. And the term Jew, which should be Judahite, refers to either people of the tribe of Judah or the different tribes that lived in the nation of Judah after the split. But both people, both houses, both nations were Israelites. But the northern house weren't Judeans, they are Judahites. They weren't. So that's confusing on how that word is used today. But I understand what he's saying. It's not that complicated, but not all Israelites are Jews or Judeans, but all Judeans are Israelites. Let's put it that way. Let's listen to what else he has to say.
And the civil war divided into 10 tribes in the north, who kept the name Israel because they were the majority, and 2 tribes in the south, who took the name Judah because the biggest of the 2 tribes was Judah. Benjamin was the other little one that stayed in the south. So that in the north you had 10 tribes in the north called Israel. In the south you had 2 tribes under the name of Judah. And the 2 biggest tribes in the north were Ephraim and Manasseh. But they kept the name of Israel because they were the majority. I want you to notice at this stage that the royal line stayed with Judah. It's rather important, this, because Jerusalem was in Judah and the royal line was of Judah. David was born in Judah. And so the royal line was over there. So the king was there while the majority of the people were here. Actually, the king Rehoboam, who followed Solomon, ruled over the 2, but these 10 wanted a king, so they set up their own, a man called Jeroboam. And from then on, through the book of Chronicles, you will find that the history of these 2 parts is separate. And it's most confusing in the Bible. They jump from one to the other. Now in the 5th year of the king of Israel began so-and-so king of Judah to reign. You've probably waded through the book of Chronicles and you jump from one to the other. And he tries to keep them both going all the way up through history. But he calls them Israel and Judah. And it's Judah that has the royal line. Now, so far, so good. That's all in the Bible. It's all historically confirmed. It's all absolutely true. Now, the next thing that happened was, I need to put captivity. I'm going to put exile. The nation got weaker and weaker, partly because it was divided into 2, but other nations around them got stronger and stronger, and God said, unless you behave rightly to each other, then you will lose the land, you'll be taken away out of it, because I only gave it to you as long as you obeyed me. And one nation that got bigger and bigger was the nation of Assyria. And finally, Assyria came. I'm going to give you very approximate dates here. Somewhere around, it was actually 743 they first came, but we'll say about 720 BC they finally dealt with the 10 northern tribes. And Assyria came around that date and took the 10 tribes away to Assyria as slaves, or most of them. A few people managed to escape to the south, but most of the 10 tribes went away off into what is now, what would it be now, Iran or Iraq? Iran, I think. Anyway, in the Mesopotamian basin, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers at the top of the Persian Gulf. So 10 tribes were taken off into slavery. Now the south hung on, Judah and Benjamin, but they were very small. And finally there arose another empire called Babylon that came, and just after, we'll say 600 to be, in round terms, it was actually 586 BC they came. So let me just round those off to try and show there was about a 100-year gap between the two. And then Babylon came, destroyed Jerusalem, and off went the two tribes into exile. Now still, so far, what is in the Bible and what British Israel teaches is identical.
Hey, I just wanted to jump in real quick and say I don't disagree with anything he said. He's absolutely right. And for those out there that may have just tuned in to this broadcast, we're doing a response broadcast where I'm responding to a lecture by Mr. Dawson here concerning his rebuttal on the Anglo-Israel message. Now let's go ahead and listen to the next clip.
But it is at this point that the new teaching comes in. The belief is, in British Israel, that in the year 650 BC, I want you to notice that date because it's before those people were taken away. Between this lot being taken away and that lot being taken, this lot, the 10 tribes, escaped. And they migrated north, and they settled on the shores of the Black Sea and in the Carpathian Mountains, where they became known as Scythians or Scythians, S-C-Y-T-H. And therefore, in 650 BC, they left the scene. And after the Jews came back from exile, when Persia had defeated Babylon, as Babylon had defeated Assyria, the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin came back to their own land and were called Judah or Jews. That's where the word Jew comes from. It's short for Judah. But that Israel had now gone up to the Black Sea. That they not only settled there, they went on moving north and west and migrated into Germany, into Russia, into Scandinavia, ultimately crossing the English Channel and settling in England. And that they were by this time known as Saxons. And that the Saxons who invaded England and others who came over, the Angles, the Danes, the Celts, and the Normans, were all part of this migration of the 10 tribes from near the Black Sea area. And so they settled there. And from Britain they went to America, so that the upshot of the teaching is that this migration, starting from the actual Holy Land itself, going to Assyria, going on to the Black Sea, going on into Europe, finally reaching the United Kingdom, and from us reaching the United States. This brings the tribes into our two countries, and therefore most of you, if not all of you, are Israelites and have Hebrew blood in you.
Okay, now I want to respond to what Dawson said there. He understands what we believe to a certain degree there correctly. We do believe in that the Israelites, after their Assyrian captivity, they did migrate. And I want to give some evidence to this in this portion here. Around 745 BC, the first deportation of the house of Israel happened by the king of Assyria. And you can read about this in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29, or 1 Chronicles 5, 25 through 26. And the Assyrians, they called the Israelites the Qumri up until about 705 BC. And I want to read a quote here from a book by biblical archaeologist E. Raymond Capp titled Missing Links Discovered in Assyrian Tablets. I would highly recommend this book on this subject. But he says this on page 99. The Assyrians in this period of time used the term House of Omri to cover both the northern kingdom of Israel, governed from Omri's capital, Samaria, and the family of Omri. The Israelites would naturally pronounce Omri as Gomri, which became Qumri in Assyrian. That would have been the first migration, or deportation actually, there of Israel. Another one happened around 724 BC, where you had the tribe of Reuben, Gad, Naphtali, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. They were taken to Assyria, but a huge migration took place as many of the Israelites fled their homes fearing another deportation. So that there was somewhat of an exodus in the land before this second deportation by Assyria, and they fled. And they were Israelites from the tribe of Dan, and they migrated to Norway, Denmark, Scotland, and Ireland. And those from the tribe of Simeon, referred to as Simeoni, migrated to Wales. And when it's Simeoni, it's Simonii. They migrated to Wales, and I want to read this quote here from J.H. Allen in his book Judas' Scepter and Joseph's Birthright on page 275. He says this, quote, "It is also unmistakably recorded in British history that the earliest settlers in Wales and southern England were called Simonii. They came by the way of the sea in the year 720 B.C. At this time there was the greatest influx of the Tethadanan to Ireland, and this synchronized with the deportation of the Israelites of the Commonwealth of Ephraim to Assyria, and the flight of Dan and Simeon from the seaports and coast country of Palestine. That Simeoni is the plural of Simeon, we need scarcely mentioned." End quote. Here's another quote from the book A General History of Ireland on page 101. It says here, "The Tethadanan came to a resolution of quitting the country for fear of falling into the hands of the Assyrians. Accordingly, they set out and wandered from place to place till they came to Norway and Denmark, where they were received with great hospitality by the inhabitants. When the Tethadanan had continued for some time in this country, they thought fit to move and look out for a new settlement, and they arrived in the north of Scotland, where they continued 7 years, and then they removed to Ireland." End quote. Another book here, The Scythians, by Rice, is the author's last name, concerning the appearance of the Scythian people, says here on page 19 of her book, says here, "The Scythians did not become a recognizable national entity before the 8th century BC. By the 7th century BC, they had established themselves firmly in southern Russia. Assyrian documents place their appearance on the shores of Lake Umra in the time of Sargon, that had been 722 to 706 BC, a date which closely corresponds with that of the establishment of the first group of Scythians in southern Russia." So here we have the establishment of, secular historians here agreeing that the Scythians did not appear near the Black Sea until after the deportation, or actually the escape of Israel from their captivity. Here's another book here, a quote from Israel's Lost Empires by Collins on page 113. He says this, quote, "Many of the people did not go into captivity, but evaded the calamity, going off with their flocks and turning nomads, and that the chief or prince whom they appointed could muster 120,000 horse or 100 foot. Because these migrating Israelites had 220,000 armed escorts, one could estimate there were at least 1 million Israelites in this group of refugees, when women, children, and elderly are included in the total. As this large group of Israelites resettled in the Black Sea region, many factors identified them as Israelites. The region to the east of the Black Sea and north of Armenia came to be known as Iberia. The presence of the Hebrew name Iberia in the region north of Armenia verifies that this was an area of Israelite resettlement for those migrating there to escape the Assyrians." End quote. Another piece of evidence is in the second book of Ezra, which is a book in the Apocrypha. Now, I don't consider the Apocrypha scripture, but it is a document that was written about 200-300 years before Christ. And in 2nd Ezra 13, verse 39 through 45, it says this, lending to the evidence of the Israelites migrating to this area. It says here, quote, "And hereas thou sawest that he gathered another peaceable multitude unto him, those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, whom Salmanasar the king of Assyria led away captive, and he carried them over the waters. And so they came into another land, but they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, and go forth unto a further country where never mankind dwelt, that they might there keep their statutes which they never kept in their own land. The same region is called Arsarioth." End quote. So this seems to lend that they migrated into the wilderness after their Assyrian captivity. They wanted to separate themselves from the Assyrians. So this lends to the credibility that they had some identity at that moment in time when they left their Assyrian captivity, because they wanted to separate themselves. So, and over time, they even lost that. Another piece of evidence I want to mention is the Beston Rock. It's a stone carving on a mountainside over there in what was formerly Persia. And after the Medes and the Persians defeated Babylon, King Darius, he expanded his empire over there, and he wanted to, around 515 BC, he ordered this huge inscription of his dominion to be chiseled on a 20-panel rock in 3 different languages. So it was kind of a Rosetta Stone in this way. And Raymond Capp, in his book, Missing Links Discovered, says this on page 114 about this rock. It says, quote, "The inscription included a list of 23 nations over whom Darius ruled, and named among these are the Sakas. In both the Persian and the Elmonite version, the original word is Saka. But in the Babylonian version, the same people are called Gumri or Gimri." End quote. Now, what this does is it shows us, it's kind of like a Rosetta Stone, where it has several different languages on there, so we can identify what other nations called certain people during that time. Now, the interesting thing is the Persians, they called the Scythians this Sakai or Saka, which on this rock here, they're identified as the Gemri, which is the Babylonian name for the Israelites. So according to this rock, the Israelites, the Gemri, are the same people as the Saka, which the Persians identify as the Scythians, which that is very significant. You can look this stone up on the internet. It's spelled Behistun. And you can look it up and you can read the inscription for yourself there. They have it translated. And that is significant. Raymond Capp says this also in his book on page 122, quote, "It is universally accepted by modern historians that the Iskazu were called Shuthae by the Greeks and Sakai or Saka by the Persians. Herodotus further tells us that the Persians called the Sakai Scythians." So, end quote. So in that, we have the Persians identifying the Sakai as Scythians. We had the Babylonian with that stone identifying the Scythians and the Sakai as Gemri. And then we have the Gemri being identified as one of the names for Israel, which was a derivative from Omri, which came from Qumri, or actually it was Omri, then Qumri, and then it derived into Gemri, which was a word, a name for the Israelites during that time, which turned into Scythians. Which, if you remember from the quote I read earlier, then the Scottish Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Arbroath, those people, the Scottish in the 1300s, identified their ancestors as being Scythians and Israelites. And all those other quotes of those men during that period in time that believed what I'm telling you now. So this is not something new. Another quote here from E. Raymond Capp's book on page 140, 1 says this, quote, "It was the Scythians pushed by the Samaritans that caused the Sumerians to move westward as Celts and Gauls, the latter name being given to them by the Romans. One branch of the Sumerians migrated from the Black Sea region in a northwestern direction to the Low Country, now Belgium, Holland, northwest Germany, to the German Ocean, now called Jutland. The Romans called these people Cimmeri, being an abbreviation of Cimmerians." Not Cimmerian with an S, by the way, with a C. Cimmerians. Just want to throw that in there. Continuing with the quote, "After entering Europe, the greater part of the Syrians moved up to Danube through Hungary and Austria into southern Germany and France, where they became known as the Greeks to the Greeks as Celts, though Romans called them Gauls." End quote. And I know some of this can be overwhelming with all these different quotes of different portions of history, and I would recommend you getting this book, Missing Links Discovered in Assyrian Tablets, because he documents everything I'm saying in much more detail than I'm able in this broadcast. But the point in saying all that is these Scythians went by different names over time, were called by different names by different people, which is not an uncommon practice. Oftentimes, very rarely, do other nations call other nations, the people there, what they want to be called. Sometimes they name them whatever they want, without going into detail into that. I want to read another quote here from The History of the Anglo-Saxons by Sharon Turner on Volume 1, page 79, says this concerning the Scythians. "The Anglo-Saxon, Lowland Scotch, Normans, Danes have all sprung from the great fountain of the first human race which we have distinguished by the terms Scythian and Gothic, crossed the Eryx, passing out of Asia, and suddenly appeared in the Europe in the 6th century BC. They have become better known to us in recent periods under the name of Getrae, or Goths, the most celebrated of their branches in the days of Caesar. The most advanced tribes of the Scythians, or the Gothic race, were known to the Romans under the name of German." End quote. With that in mind, I want to recommend another book, Israel's Post-Captivity Names by William Pascal Gord, another really good book. In fact, Mr. Dawson mentioned Pascal Gord a little while ago, but I would recommend getting that book. It's still in print. You can get it from Artisan Publishers. And he goes into all these post-captivity names and who called who what and where they all came from, which is key in identifying who these people are and who they became. I want to read another quote here out of a book that I just recently found a copy of. It's Israel's Wanderings, or the Scuths, Saxons, and Cymri, written in 1892. He says this on page 18 concerning the Celts, quote, "Professor O'Curry adds unconscious testimony of a striking character. Without the least attempt to account for it, he states that there certainly exist amongst the early colonizers of Ireland, from a period contemporary with, if not anterior to, their original landing in the island, a system of law in several points similar to the ancient Hebrew law. This similarity is observed in the law of contracts, service for debt. Also in the requital of death with death, this law was actually said to be the Mosaic law, a tradition also simply narrated without comment, but at the same time included among the trustworthy sources of early history, not amongst the monkish fictions. The Druids are also discussed by the same authority and traced to the east, with rites which can scarcely be explained except on the suspicion of an Israelite origin. On this point, there is the following interesting passage in the historical work of Sharon Turner. Quote, "Of the Druidical superstitions, we have no monuments remaining unless the circles of stones which are to be seen in some parts of the island are deemed their temples. Of all the superstitions concerning Stonehenge and Avebury, it seems the most rational to ascribe them to the Druidic order. And of this system we may remark that if it was the creation of a more civilized people, none of the colonizers of Britain are so likely to have been its parents as the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians." End quote. This is just more evidence showing and revealing to the Anglo-Saxon people more of their biblical identity as Israel. And the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, they're connected to Israel as well. I don't have time to go into it, but I would recommend Stephen Collins' books on this subject. And if you want to email me for information on that, I can show you where to get them. But he has a whole series that goes into detail in that. A very well-documented book. And I'd also recommend the book that I've mentioned several times in this, E. Raymond Capp's book, Missing Links Discovered in Assyrian Tablets. That is a man, a biblical archaeologist, very well written. He has written numerous books on this subject. And if you want to learn more, that is what I would recommend you get into. Because it looks like this is going to be a two-part broadcast, because I'm about out of time and I don't have enough time to play the next clip. But Lord willing, I will get back to that next week. Now, for those wanting to learn more about the Anglo-Israel message, that is the belief that the Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, and Scandinavian, and Celtic, and Kindred people, send me an email. Go to my website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org. Send me an email. You can go to my YouTube channel. I've taught on this and preached on this many times. But if you send me an email, I'll send you a list of recommended books that I would recommend that you get a hold of. That are easily accessible. And if you deny it, if you don't think what I'm saying is true, that's fine, but you can read the position and learn another position, another belief. And if you would like, you can go to my website and read a book that I just got done publishing. It's not a very big book. It's very introductory in nature, but it's called The Dispersed of Israel, and it is about the migrations of Israel, on how they were dispersed and they became the diaspora of Israel, and how using that Greek word diaspora in the Septuagint in the New Testament, you can identify Israel as being who they are today. And it was a promise that they would be dispersed and they would migrate because of their sins. And you can use that Greek word to identify them. I also go into who the Romans are in that book, and there's also an article in there on the word Gentile, and you can go read that for free at my website along with my other work. And like I said, if you would like to learn more about the Anglo-Israel message, shoot me an email, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org, and I will send you a list of books that you can get a hold of. Another book that I would recommend, and actually it's not just a book, it's actually a Bible class that you can do online, is Bible Mastery Boot Camp. You can go to BibleMasteryBootCamp.com. This Bible class is put together by a friend of mine, Lawrence Blanchard, Dr. Lawrence Blanchard. I've had him on the program before. And you can do this class online. You can order DVDs, and you can do it with others. And it's several modules. I think it's 4 modules in total, but I start with Module 1 and go through the class. And by the time you get to Module 2, he breaks down all these migrations in a lot of detail. And you can go do that online, or you can order the copy and do it at home with others. I would highly recommend anyone out there that believes this or doesn't believe this truth to go get that Bible course and do it. Invite your friends and family to do it with you. It's very easy to do, and you'll learn a lot by doing it. Well, thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. We have a lot more to cover next week, and we'll jump back into this subject in responding to this lecture by Mr. Dawson next week. So thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries Worldwide. Come back next week for another broadcast. And if you want to learn more about Christian America Ministries, go to our website, ChristianAmericaMinistries.org. And if you're listening to us on Shortwave, be sure to send us a reception report, and I'll send you a free copy of my book, Israel Dispersed, just as a thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you for listening to Christian America Ministries. If you are blessed by this outreach ministry, please consider going to www.christianamericaministries.org to our contact page and donating to our radio ministry to help keep this program on the air. We appreciate